The moment my father lifted his glass and looked straight through me like I wasn't sitting 3 feet away from him, I understood something I had been pretending not to know for years. He wasn't embarrassed by what I did for a living. He was embarrassed by me. I want you to understand what that room felt like. 42 people in a private dining room at Hargrove's, which is the kind of restaurant where the napkins are thicker than most people's bath towels. Candles everywhere. The kind of soft lighting that makes everyone look important. My brother had just been named Chief of Cardiology at Mercy General at 34 years old, which was, by any measure, a remarkable thing. My mother had been planning this dinner for 6 weeks. I know because she called me 4 times during those 6 weeks, and not once did any of those calls include the words, "How are you doing?" They were all logistics. Had I confirmed my RSVP? Did I know the dress code? Was I bringing him? Him. That was always how she referred to my boyfriend when she spoke to me. Not his name, just him. Like saying his name out loud would make the whole situation more real than she was willing to let it be. His name is Marcus. He had been my boyfriend for 2 years and 3 months by the night of that dinner, and in that entire time, my parents had met him exactly twice. Both times they were polite the way people are polite to someone they've decided doesn't matter. Correct. Distant. Performing courtesy without actually feeling any of it. My father is a man who has spent 30 years building a reputation. He trained at Johns Hopkins. He has publications, awards, a fellowship named after one of his mentors that he helped fund. In our family, your credentials were the first thing you learned to recite. By the time I was 8 years old, I could explain what my father did in language that impressed adults at dinner parties. By the time I was 12, I understood that impressing adults at dinner parties was one of the primary functions of being part of our family. My brother followed the path perfectly. Pre-med at Duke, medical school at Vanderbilt, residency, fellowship, now this. Chief of Cardiology. My mother kept saying the title out loud all evening, rotating it into conversation the way you work a sore muscle. Chief of Cardiology. Her son, the Chief of Cardiology. And then there was me. I teach 4th grade at Millbrook Elementary in a district 40 minutes outside the city. I have been teaching for 6 years. I love it in the way that I imagine people love things they were made to do, not because every day is easy, because it is absolutely not, but because there is a specific kind of meaning in it that I cannot imagine finding anywhere else. I had a student 2 years ago, a boy named Caleb, who came to me in September, unable to read more than a handful of words. By April, he was reading chapter books. By June, he stood up at our end-of-year celebration and read a passage aloud in front of the entire school, and I had to press my thumbnail into my palm to keep myself together. I have never once described that moment to my father. I learned early that it wouldn't land the way I needed it to. My father wanted me to go to medical school. When I told him I wanted to teach, he said, "That's a fine thing to do for a year while you figure out what you actually want." When I told him, a year later, that I was still teaching and intended to keep teaching, he went quiet in that particular way. He has not angry, exactly, more like he was recalibrating his expectations downward. My mother called me the following week and said, in her most careful voice, that she just wanted to make sure I had thought this through. I had thought it through. I had thought it through more carefully than either of them knew. Marcus I met at a farmer's market on a Saturday morning in October. I had gone for apple cider and ended up standing in front of a booth selling handmade furniture for 20 minutes because the workmanship was genuinely beautiful. The man running the booth was quiet, patient, not at all interested in selling me anything I didn't want. He answered my questions directly. He had sawdust on his forearm, and the kind of steady, unhurried confidence that I have since learned is either something you're born with or something you earn the very hard way. I bought a small side table. He helped me carry it to my car. I asked if he wanted to get coffee. What I knew about Marcus in those early months was this. He was 31. He worked with wood. He had grown up outside of Knoxville. He had a younger sister he was close to, and he read more than almost anyone I had ever met. He kept books in his truck. He had opinions about architecture. He made me laugh in a way that felt easy rather than performed. What I did not know, because he did not tell me and I did not push, was the full scope of what his work actually was. He had mentioned a company. He said he did custom work, renovation, design. I had been to his workshop, which was large and organized and smelled like cedar and linseed oil, and I had assumed, based on what I saw, that he was successful in the way that a skilled craftsman in a mid-sized city can be successful. Comfortable, good at what he does, building something steady. I did not understand, yet, what he had actually built. My mother called 3 weeks before my brother's promotion dinner and said she hoped I would come alone. She didn't phrase it as a request. She phrased it as a hope, which in my family is a request with extra steps. I told her I was bringing Marcus. She said, "Claire, this is a very important night for your brother." I said I understood that, and that my bringing my boyfriend of 2 years to a family dinner did not change that fact. She went quiet. Then she said she would see me at 7. I told Marcus about the call that night. We were sitting on his back porch and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Do you want me to come?" Not defensive, not hurt, just checking. "Yes," I said. "I want you to come." He nodded and went back to his book. The dinner was on a Friday. I wore a green dress I had bought specifically for the occasion, because I knew my mother would notice if I underdressed, and I wanted to remove that particular ammunition from the conversation. Marcus wore a dark jacket over a gray shirt and he looked good, which I noticed and which I knew, somewhere in the back of my mind, would make no difference to my parents whatsoever. We were seated at the far end of the second table. I want you to picture the room. There were 2 long tables. The first table held my parents, my brother and his wife, my brother's in-laws, my father's colleague and department chair, and 2 other senior physicians from Mercy General. The second table was where Marcus and I sat, along with my cousin who had driven up from Atlanta, her husband who my family had never fully warmed to, and 2 of my brother's friends from residency who were pleasant but clearly there to fill chairs. My father gave a toast before dinner. It was a good toast. He talked about my brother's work ethic, his dedication, his sacrifice. He talked about what it meant to see a child become someone exceptional. He used the word legacy. He used the word proud 3 times. My mother was nodding with her eyes bright, her pearl earrings catching the candlelight. Then he looked toward our table. He did not look at me specifically. He looked in the general direction of the second table, the way you look at a window when you're thinking about something else. And he said, almost as an aside, almost as a joke, "And of course, all of our family is here tonight." Pause. Small smile. Claire teaches school. The way he said it, I need you to understand the way he said it. It wasn't an introduction. It was a footnote. It was the verbal equivalent of a shrug. It landed in the room and dissolved without anyone reacting because it was designed to be exactly that, a nothing, a parenthetical, a brief acknowledgement that I existed before the real conversation continued. I picked up my water glass and took a slow sip. Marcus, beside me, said nothing. His expression didn't change. His hand found mine under the table for exactly 3 seconds, and then he let go and reached for the bread. My cousin glanced at me from across the table. I looked back at her steadily, and she looked away. The dinner progressed. The food was excellent. I ate it. I talked with my cousin's husband about his work in logistics, which was genuinely interesting, and with one of my brother's friends about a hiking trail I had done the previous fall. I was present. I was fine. My brother came over to our table during the appetizers to say hello. He hugged me, shook Marcus's hand, and said it was good to see us. My brother has always been different from my parents in the specific way that some people who are loved correctly manage to turn out decent even inside systems that might have made them otherwise. He is not the problem in my family. He never was. My father came over once, briefly, to check in the way you check in on guests you are obligated to acknowledge. He shook Marcus's hand. He said, "Marcus, good to see you." He said my name. He said the food was good. Then he went back to the first table. It was during the main course that it happened. There was a man at the first table whom I didn't recognize, heavy-set, silver-haired, with the easy authority of someone who had spent decades in rooms where people listened to him. He had been seated next to my father's department chair, and they had been in close conversation for most of the meal. I had noticed him in the way you notice people you don't know at family events, catalogued him as a colleague of someone, and moved on. Midway through the entree, this man stood to refill his wine from the bottle on the table, and in doing so he turned, and his eyes went across the second table and found Marcus. He stopped. Not a polite pause. A full stop, like a car braking hard. He stared for a moment and then he said, loud enough that the first table heard him clearly and the second table heard him even more clearly. Wait. Marcus Webb? Marcus looked up from his plate. The man was already moving, coming around the end of the first table, hand extended. And he was smiling the way people smile when they see someone they genuinely respect. I'll be damned, he said. I didn't know you'd be here. Marcus stood and shook his hand and they spoke quietly for a moment, and I watched my father's face go through several expressions in fast succession. Interest, confusion, a recalibration of something. The man I would learn his name was Dr. Harmon, the chief of medicine at St. Augustine and the lead figure behind a major new hospital campus development that had been in the news for the better part of a year, turned to the table and said, "Do any of you know what this man built?" He gestured at Marcus with the warmth of genuine admiration. He designed and built the entire interior of our surgical wing expansion. Every custom installation, the consultation suites, the recovery spaces. The families of our patients send us letters about those rooms. Letters about how the space made them feel less afraid. The table was quiet. My father was looking at Marcus with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Dr. Harmon kept going, because he was clearly a man who, once he started talking about something he cared about, did not stop easily. He talked about the firm Marcus had built. He talked about the scope of the work hospitals, university buildings, a courthouse renovation that had received a National Design Award 2 years prior. He talked about a children's library Marcus's company had completed pro bono in a neighborhood that had needed it for a decade. I sat with my hands in my lap, and I breathed evenly. My mother was very still. Dr. Harmon clapped Marcus on the shoulder and said, "We're actually trying to get him for the East Wing expansion. He keeps telling me his timeline is full." He laughed. "I keep telling him, we'll wait." He went back to his seat. The conversation at the first table resumed, quieter than before. Marcus sat back down. He picked up his fork. He looked at me, and something passed between us that I don't have a precise word for. Not triumph, not vindication exactly. Something steadier than either of those things. He said, quietly, "You okay?" "Yes," I said. "Good food," he said. "Yeah," I said. And I meant it, about more than the food. After dinner, during the period when people stand and circulate, and the event becomes a cocktail party with the remnants of a meal, my father found us near the window. He shook Marcus's hand again, differently this time. He asked questions, genuine ones, the kind he reserves for people he has decided are worth his attention. How large is the firm? How many projects? The hospital work, is that a specialty, or one of several areas? Marcus answered everything the same way he answers everything. Directly, without performance, without trying to impress. I stood beside them, and I did not feel the particular bittersweet satisfaction of a child finally proven right to a difficult parent. I had spent years imagining that moment might feel like something, like relief, maybe, like a door opening. Mostly I felt tired. My father turned to me at one point and said, "You didn't tell us much about what Marcus does." I looked at him for a moment. "You didn't ask," I said. He had no response to that. Not a hostile silence, more like a man confronting simple arithmetic that should have been obvious and wasn't. My mother found me by the coat check at the end of the night. She looked polished and composed, the way she always looks polished and composed, but there was something working behind her eyes. She said, "He seems very accomplished." I said, "He is." She said, "I didn't realize." I said, "I know you didn't." There was a pause between us. She said, "I want you to know I'm proud of you too, Claire." And I stood there with my coat over my arm, and I thought about Caleb reading his passage in June, and about the 6 years I had spent in that classroom, and about the fact that my mother's pride had, apparently, I've been waiting this whole time for something I hadn't given her yet. I said, "I have to go find Marcus." And I went. In the car on the way home, Marcus drove and I looked out the window at the city going by, and after a few minutes he said, "You went somewhere." "I'm here," I said. "You went somewhere," he said again, not unkindly. I turned away from the window. "Did you know Dr. Harmon would be there?" "No," he said. "If he hadn't been," I said. "If that hadn't happened, would tonight have been different for you?" He thought about this. He had his hand on the wheel and he was watching the road, and he thought about it with the same care he brings to anything he is asked to consider seriously. I was going to be the same person tonight either way, he said. I know, I said. That's why I asked. He glanced over at me. Are you asking if I'm bothered that it took someone vouching for me? Maybe. I'm bothered that it matters to them, he said. I'm not bothered that it happened. He looked back at the road. People have maps of the world in their heads. Sometimes something changes the map. I'm not going to be angry at a map. I thought about that for a long time. The weeks after the dinner were strange. My mother called more often, which sounds better than it was, because the calls had a quality of effort to them that made me feel I was being managed. She asked about my classroom. She asked about my students. The questions had the shape of curiosity, without quite the texture of it, like someone reading from a list of things a supportive parent asks. I answered. I was not unkind, but I held something back that I hadn't decided yet whether to offer. My father took longer. He's a man who does not change directions quickly. Partly because changing directions requires admitting the previous direction was wrong, and that particular admission is not in his skill set. But about 3 weeks after the dinner, he called me on a Sunday morning, which was unusual, because Sunday mornings he is at the hospital or on the golf course, and does not generally use the time to call his youngest child. He asked about my school, and then he asked something I had not heard him ask in 6 years of teaching. He said, "What's it actually like? The work?" I paused for long enough that he said, "Claire?" "I'm here," I said, and then I told him about Caleb. The whole story, September to June, every part of it, the frustration, and the small victories, and the afternoon in April, when something clicked, and I watched it happen in real time, and it was one of the most extraordinary things I have ever witnessed. I told him about the reading at the end of the year. I told him about pressing my thumbnail into my palm. He was quiet when I finished. He said, "I didn't know about that." "You didn't ask," I said. Same words as before. I wasn't trying to wound him with them. It was just the truth. He said, "No, I didn't." And then he said something I had waited a long time to hear, and when it came, it was smaller and quieter than I had imagined. Which is maybe how honest things often are. He said, "I should have." We were on the phone for another hour. Longest conversation we'd had in years. I am not going to tell you that fixed everything, because it didn't. What's broken in a family over a decade doesn't mend in a Sunday phone call. But something shifted. I felt it shift. What I want to be clear about, and I want to be clear about this because I've been turning it over for months and I've worked out what I actually think, is that the dinner itself should have changed nothing. If Dr. Harmon hadn't been there, if Marcus had been exactly what my parents assumed he was, my parents' treatment of us should not have been contingent on Marcus building hospital wings and winning design awards. The problem was never what Marcus did for a living. The problem was that they had decided who counted before they knew anything real about him. Before they knew anything real about me, either the me that existed outside of the story they'd written about my life being a disappointment. I teach 4th grade. I have spent 6 years building the kind of foundation in children that determines, in ways that are hard to quantify but impossible to overstate, what they will be capable of for the rest of their lives. I have had kids come back to visit me years later. I have had parents write me letters. I have sat with a child who was struggling and frightened and found a way to make the room feel safe enough that something in them opened up and let the learning in. That is not a lesser thing. That is not a consolation prize version of a meaningful life. Marcus knows this. He knew it before anyone recognized him at a dinner party. He knew it the night I told him about Caleb, when he set down his book and gave me his full attention and said, "That's serious work. You know that, right?" I had looked at him for a long moment, and something in me had settled that I hadn't realized was unsettled. We've talked about the dinner a lot since then. About what it meant and what it didn't mean. About forgiveness and what it actually requires versus what people assume it requires. Marcus thinks forgiveness is not the same as pretending something didn't happen, and I agree with him. My parents hurt me. They hurt me in ways that accumulated over years into something I will be untangling for a long time. Seeing them revise their behavior toward Marcus once they understood his professional standing does not erase what was underneath the original behavior. It actually reveals it more clearly. But I also think people can want to do better and mean it. I think my father on that Sunday phone call was real. I think my mother's questions, effortful as they are, come from something genuine, even if that something is still learning how to move. I am willing to see what it becomes. My brother called me a month after the dinner and said, "I'm sorry about how Dad introduced you that night." He had been thinking about it, he said, and he knew it wasn't okay. I told him, I appreciated that. He said, "You're doing something real, Claire. The stuff you do in that classroom, it's real." I told him I knew that. He said, "I know you know. I just wanted you to hear me say it." That one hit different. Marcus and I are spending Thanksgiving with his family this year. His mother makes an absurd amount of food and argues loudly about football teams with his sister and laughs at things with her whole body, and I find being around her deeply restoring in a way I am still learning to let myself have. My parents have been invited to Christmas. I told them what I needed from the visit: that Marcus's name would be used, that the conversation would not circle back to professional pedigree, that I was coming as myself and he was coming as himself, and those selves were not up for evaluation. My mother said she understood. My father said he would be there. We'll see what we see. What I know is this. I stood in that room, and I did not perform myself smaller to make anyone comfortable. I have spent years doing that, and I am finished with it. My students need me at my actual size. Not a diminished version of me, performing adequacy to placate people who haven't done the work to understand what I actually do. Marcus did not rescue me that night. Dr. Harmon, recognizing him, changed the temperature of a room, but it didn't change who I was. I drove to that dinner already whole. I drove home the same way. The only thing that changed was my parents finally had to look at what they'd been doing and decide whether they wanted to keep doing it. That part was never mine to control. It was never mine to earn. Some things you cannot be good enough to compel from another person. You can only be clear about what you require, and honest about what you're willing to meet. I have learned to tell the difference between the two. It took longer than it should have. I am grateful I got there. Caleb sent me a letter last month. He's in 7th grade now. He said he's in the advanced reading group and his teacher told him he was exceptional. He said he wanted me to know because he remembered me telling him that working hard at something hard was worth it. I read it at my kitchen table while Marcus was in the other room, and I did not press my thumbnail into my palm this time. I just let myself feel it.